Along the South Fork of the Stillaguamish River, there are three types of areas where gold can be found. The first is in bedrock crevices, the second in tree roots as they cross active areas of river flow, and the third is in moss. So what we will talk about here is recovering gold from moss, and I'll show you the technique I use. Watch my first video on gold mining on the Stille River for locations if you are interested in Northwest Washington. Mainly along the Stillaguamish River, this is the South Fork, you want to be inside the Robe Canyon and slightly above the water level to begin mossing. You will find the canyon cuts directly through bedrock, and finding moss along the river is not a problem. There are three types of moss you should be interested in. The most ubiquitous is fork moss, as shown here. Note the flake of gold next to the fork moss. This picture was not staged. When you remove the moss, if it is somewhat rich in gold, you'll see the gold particles attached to the root systems as you lift them up, or particles of gold left behind in the residual root systems you didn't completely remove. More about this later. Now here, in the lower right corner, is some more fork moss. The other moss pictured is far more stringy and long, usually removes easier, and seems to require more dirt to live. Ideally, this is the best moss to prospect. This type of moss is called river feather moss and also prospects very nicely. You don't see too much of this along the river though. Moss removes far easier wet than dry, so during midsummer I pre-wet the moss with river water from a small tin bucket. Then I use a paint-removing scraper tool to lift the moss from the bedrock. The moss then goes into the pail with water, where the dirt from the plant is separated. Myself, I don't throw the separated moss into the river, but try to evenly distribute it back on the river bank. I would rather let Mother Nature slowly wash the moss back into the river than dump it all back in at one time. I think that makes more ecologic sense. When you are done, dump the pail contents into your gold pan and simply process. Take care not to slip on the wet bedrock and go into the river. The river stays rapid continuously throughout the Robe Canyon. Now, this is really important. Even with all the moss removed from the bedrock, you are probably only recovering about 50% of the gold. The rest of the gold finds its way into the very smallest of nooks and crannies in the rock itself. So carefully wet your rock down and inspect for gold flakes. I use a semi-wet round of tissue to mop them up as I see them. In this picture here, there are at least 7 flakes within about 2 inches of my hand. Hey, they might be small, but it all adds up. And the least you can do is recover all of the gold for the life of the moss that you have taken. Here is a pan just with gold recovered by sight of an area about 2 feet wide and 2 feet long. Once you have made a review of the bedrock by sight, don't assume all the gold is recovered. It's not. So what I do is remove U-shaped patches of moss and then use a scrub brush and gardening water can, pouring the water from the top down in fairly large volume, scrubbing as I go. The object is to loosen the residual gold and direct it into the unharvested moss below. This technique isn't perfect, but once you remove that layer of moss the water was directed down into, you will find more gold than usual. This pan shows the gold recovered using this method. which is the exact same area you saw the previous pan findings in. Not too bad. Other things to note. Please try and pan only around bedrock. If you pan around a gravel bar, you could be disturbing areas of fish breeding. There are virtually no areas in the Rogue to use a sluice box. There is a deep and immediate drop-off from the bank to the water. Also, you probably will not be processing enough dirt to justify its use anyway. To conform to state regulations of 2011, you may use pans, sluices, and rockers with riffle areas totaling 3 square feet or less without any timing restrictions. That means you can use them throughout the year. Make sure you stay within the scour zone of the river, though. Sluices must be only placed on bedrock. And remember that the Robe Canyon is rich in history, considering everything from the home of the Stillaguamish tribe to the building of the Everett-Monte Cristo Railroad. Please be respectful of the history and the flora and fauna that are there today.